My name is Amelia. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been someone people describe as steady, dependable, the kind of woman who doesn't make waves. I work in a corporate environment where results matter, but personality often matters more. If you asked my coworkers to describe me back then, they'd probably say I was competent, quiet, maybe even kind, someone safe, someone predictable. What they wouldn't say is powerful. I've always been underestimated, and not in a dramatic way. It was softer than that, quieter. The kind of underestimation that sounds like trust but feels like dismissal. People assumed I was fine where I was, that I didn't want more, that I wouldn't push back. And for a long time, I let that assumption live comfortably around me, like furniture no one thought to move. This story isn't about rage. It's not about revenge either. It's about a series of small decisions, some made by others, one very deliberate decision made by me, and how they quietly reshaped several lives, including my own. It's about proximity to power, and what happens when morality collides with survival. At the center of this story is a coworker who trusted me, genuinely. Someone who believed we were on the same side, even as we were quietly being measured against each other. They were approaching a promotion everyone knew was coming, a role with visibility, authority, and a bonus that could change someone's life. That bonus mattered to me more than I was willing to admit at the time. I needed it more than I needed a conscience, or at least that's what I told myself. What follows is not a confession designed to shock you. I'm not here to justify myself, and I'm not here to be punished. I'm here to tell the truth, as cleanly as I can remember it. The emotional arc of this story moves slowly, from invisibility to awareness to choice to consequence. There are no villains twirling, no explosive confrontations, just people doing what they believe they must, until the cost becomes unavoidable. You may find yourself sympathizing with me at times. You may not. You may feel more for the person I hurt. Both reactions are valid. I'm not asking you to take my side, only to stay with me long enough to understand how someone like me could do something like this without ever raising her voice. If you've ever been the reliable one, the overlooked one, the person who realized too late that being trusted doesn't always mean being protected, then you might recognize parts of yourself in what I'm about to share. Before we begin the story itself, I want to ask you something, gently and without judgment. Have you ever crossed a quiet line? Not because you were cruel, but because you were afraid of what would happen if you didn't? To them, I was useful. That's the word I'd choose now, looking back. Not valued, not respected, just useful. I was the person who remembered where things were stored, how decisions had been justified 3 quarters ago, which numbers were reliable, and which ones only looked good in presentations. I was the one people CC'd when they needed confirmation, not when they needed vision. In meetings, I spoke when spoken to. When I did speak, people nodded. Sometimes, they even wrote things down. Then the conversation moved on, usually guided by someone louder, faster, more visibly ambitious. No one interrupted me. No one challenged me. And somehow, that was worse. I wasn't invisible in the sense of being ignored completely. I was invisible in the way infrastructure is invisible. You don't praise a bridge for standing. You only notice it when it collapses. My coworkers saw me as calm, maybe even selfless. The kind of woman who didn't mind staying late to clean up a report or double-check someone else's assumptions. They trusted me with details, with drafts, with half-formed thoughts they weren't ready to attach their names to yet. That trust felt like intimacy at the time. It felt like inclusion. What I didn't understand then was that trust and elevation are not the same thing. The coworker at the center of this story, I'll call them Daniel, saw me the same way everyone else did, but warmer. We worked closely, often paired on projects that needed both analytical depth and coordination across teams. Daniel was personable, ambitious, and visibly marked for advancement. Managers listened to him differently. When he spoke, people leaned in. He trusted me, not just professionally, but casually. He vented to me, asked for my opinion, shared doubts he didn't voice upward. There was no malice in it. If anything, there was comfort. I was safe. I wasn't a competition in his mind. And maybe, for a long time, I wasn't. I told myself I didn't care about titles, that I preferred stability, that ambition looked exhausting. These weren't lies exactly, but they weren't the full truth either. The fuller truth was that I'd learned early on how dangerous it felt to want more when no one seemed inclined to offer it. So I became agreeable, precise, reliable. I became the person who made other people look good without ever appearing to seek credit. And the longer I played that role, the more natural it felt. To them, and eventually to me. When Daniel talked about his upcoming promotion, he didn't brag. He spoke about it like something that had simply reached him, the way weather does. "They've been hinting," he said once, leaning against my desk. "Nothing official yet, but yeah." I smiled. I congratulated him early. I meant it. At least, I thought I did. Inside, something quieter happened. Not jealousy, not anger, just a small, precise awareness that the path forward for him was visible, supported, assumed, and mine, if it existed at all, was undefined. No one ever sat me down and said, "This is all you'll be." That would have been easier to resist. Instead, they rewarded me with appreciation, with dependence, with trust that kept me exactly where I was. I was indispensable, which somehow made me immobile. I didn't resent Daniel for his success. I resented the system that made his trajectory feel inevitable, and mine feel optional. But resentment is a slippery thing. It looks outward until it doesn't. At the time, if you'd asked me who I was to them, I would have said, a team player, a professional, a good colleague. Now, I understand that I was something more specific. I was the person everyone assumed would stay exactly where she was, quietly supporting the rise of others. And I let them assume that, because challenging it felt riskier than accepting it. At least it did back then. The first cut was so small I almost missed it. That's the thing about moments that change you. They rarely announce themselves. They slip into your day disguised as inconvenience, misunderstanding, or timing. If you're not careful, you explain them away before they ever have a chance to hurt. It happened during a project review meeting. Nothing high stakes on paper. Just a cross-team sync to walk leadership through a process improvement we'd been building for months. Daniel and I had worked on it side by side. I'd done the back-end analysis, built the tracking logic, and flagged the long-term risks. He'd shaped the narrative, turned it into something leadership could digest. That division of labor wasn't unusual. It worked. Until it didn't. When the meeting started, Daniel shared his screen. My name was on several slides, small, tucked into the footer, but as he spoke, he referred to the work as something I've been developing, and my approach to streamlining. Not once, repeatedly, casually, like it was obvious. I waited. I assumed he'd correct it, or that someone else would. They didn't. No one looked at me. No one asked a follow-up that would naturally pull me in. Heads nodded. A director smiled and said, "This is exactly the kind of ownership we want to see at the next level." Ownership. The word landed harder than it should have. I told myself it was semantics, that he didn't mean to erase me, that leadership knew I was involved. After all, I was in the meeting. I was literally right there. When it ended, people congratulated Daniel. He accepted it with that same easy humility. Then he turned to me and said, "Great work, as always," like a reflex, like punctuation. I smiled back. Of course I did. That afternoon, I opened the shared folder and looked at the version history. My name filled the margins, comments, formulas, revisions, evidence if I ever needed it. I closed the folder without doing anything else. That was the first small cut. Not the credit itself, but how easy it was for everyone to let it happen. How normal it felt. How little resistance it encountered, including from me. Over the next few weeks, variations of that moment repeated. Daniel would summarize insights I'd sent him privately. Managers would ask him questions about systems I maintained. When someone thanked me directly, it was for being supportive. When they praised him, it was for being strategic. No one was being cruel. That's what made it harder to name. I started paying closer attention. Not in a paranoid way, just observant. I noticed how often I was looped in after decisions were framed. How my role was to validate, not to direct. How Daniel was increasingly positioned as the point person, while I became the safety net underneath him. Once during a one-on-one, my manager said, "You're such a stabilizing presence. Teams rely on you." It was meant as a compliment. I nodded. Inside, something tightened. Stability, I was learning, is not the same as momentum. I considered speaking up. Not dramatically. Just a clarifying email, a casual correction in the next meeting. But every time I drafted the words, I heard a quieter voice asking, "Is this worth it? Would it make me look petty, defensive, difficult?" Daniel had never wronged me overtly. He trusted me. He confided in me. He assumed I was okay with the way things were unfolding, and I'd done nothing to contradict that assumption. So I stayed quiet, and in that quiet, something subtle shifted. I stopped assuming goodwill would protect me. I stopped believing that being essential meant being safe. I began to understand that if I didn't define my value, someone else would do it for me, and they'd do it in whatever way best served them. At the time, I still thought the situation was recoverable, that this was just a phase, a misunderstanding I could smooth over with patience. I didn't yet realize that patience in environments like ours is often interpreted as consent. Disrespect rarely arrives as an event. It settles in as a pattern. Once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. Not in Daniel, not in the broader team, not in myself. The small cuts began to form a shape, and that shape had edges. Still, nothing dramatic happened. No raised voices, no open conflicts, just repetition, quiet and cumulative. Daniel started scheduling meetings without checking my availability, then apologizing afterward, as if it were an unavoidable oversight. "I figured you'd catch up on the notes," he'd say, smiling. And I would. Of course I would. Because the notes depended on systems I managed, and I wanted them to be accurate. I was consulted after decisions, not before them. I was asked to sense-check strategies that had already been pitched. When leadership needed reassurance that something would hold, they asked me. When they needed someone to stand in front of the room and claim the idea, they asked him. At first, I framed it as efficiency. Daniel was being groomed for leadership. I was being trusted with continuity. We were playing complementary roles. That's what I told myself, and it sounded reasonable enough to silence the discomfort. What I didn't admit was how tiring it became to be reasonable all the time. There were moments, small, fleeting, when I could have pushed back. When someone said, "Daniel, can you walk us through how this works?" And I could have added lightly, "I built that part. I can explain." But each time the moment passed, someone else spoke. The conversation moved on. I learned the rhythm of being overlooked. It had a tempo, a predictability, and once something becomes predictable, it starts to feel permanent. The strangest part was how easily everyone adapted to this version of me. The quieter I became, the more I was trusted with sensitive information. Budgets, early drafts, internal disagreements. People spoke freely around me because they didn't see me as a threat. I was a container, not a contender. Daniel especially leaned into that. He would forward me emails with a quick "thoughts" attached, or ask me late in the day to review something before I send it upstairs. I did. I always did. And each time, a small part of my contribution became absorbed into his momentum. I started keeping my own notes, not out of spite but clarity. Dates, context, who said what and when. It wasn't a plan. It was self-defense, a way to reassure myself that I wasn't imagining the pattern. At home, I told myself to be grateful. I had job security, respect of a kind. People liked me. Why risk that by asking for more? But the truth was harder to ignore at work, especially as Daniel's promotion became less hypothetical. Leadership included him in conversations I wasn't invited to. He began speaking with the confidence of someone already halfway into the role. One afternoon, I overheard a manager say, "Daniel's really stepped up. He's got such a good support system around him." Support system. I was standing 5 feet away. That night, I opened my laptop and updated my resume for the first time in years. Not because I planned to leave, but because I needed to remember that I was more than the role they'd assigned me. That I had options, even if I wasn't ready to use them. Still, I didn't confront anyone. I normalized the disrespect the same way everyone else did, by adjusting myself around it, by lowering expectations, by telling myself that dignity could be preserved through endurance. I convinced myself that silence was professionalism, that staying composed meant staying moral, that as long as I wasn't actively harming anyone, I was doing the right thing. Looking back, I see how flawed that logic was. Silence doesn't preserve fairness. It preserves the status quo. At the time, though, I wasn't ready to disrupt anything. I was still hoping that recognition would arrive organically, the way it seemed to for others. I still believed that if I kept doing excellent work, someone would eventually notice. What I didn't understand was that they had noticed. They had just decided what to do with what they saw. The realization didn't come as a shock. It came as a quiet settling. I understood the role I'd been assigned one afternoon while reviewing a document I hadn't been invited to co-author. It was a strategic roadmap, long-term, high visibility. Daniel's name was on the cover. Mine appeared once, buried in a section labeled Operational Support. Operational support, not architecture, not design, support. I stared at that phrase longer than necessary, not because it offended me, but because it clarified something I'd been avoiding. This wasn't an accident, it was a narrative. And narratives, once written, are hard to revise. In the eyes of leadership, Daniel was the driver. I was the stabilizer. He was the future. I was the foundation. Useful, respected, and permanently behind the scenes. No one had told me this outright. They didn't need to. My calendar told me. My access told me. The way decisions bypassed me told me. The most unsettling part was how well I fit the role. I was good at it. I anticipated needs. I absorbed pressure. I smoothed over gaps before anyone else noticed them. I made the system look seamless, and in doing so, erased the visibility of my own labor. When I spoke with Daniel about work, he assumed alignment. Not maliciously, comfortably. He'd say things like, "You're amazing at keeping everything together," or, "I don't know how I'd manage without you." And I believed him. I just didn't believe that managing without me was ever something he'd have to learn. Once I hinted, just slightly. We were grabbing coffee after a long day, and he mentioned the promotion process again. I said, "It's interesting how differently they position people, even when the work overlaps." He laughed, not unkindly. "Yeah, well, you know how it is. Some people just like being in the spotlight more." I let the comment pass, but it stayed with me, because it wasn't true, and because it excused everything that followed. I didn't dislike the spotlight. I disliked fighting for it in a room that had already decided who it belonged to. From that point on, I stopped waiting to be seen. Instead, I started observing how power actually moved. Who spoke first? Who summarized? Who was deferred to? I noticed that being right mattered less than being positioned as right. That credit flowed upward, not outward. I also noticed how often people underestimated my awareness. They spoke freely around me, assuming I wasn't tracking implications, that I wasn't strategic, that I was content. That assumption became my cover. I continued doing my job, outwardly unchanged. I met deadlines. I answered questions. I smiled. But internally, something had shifted. I stopped identifying with the role they'd given me. I started seeing it as a mask, one that offered access without scrutiny. The role of the reliable one comes with privileges. You're trusted with raw information. You're looped into early drafts. You're asked to verify, to confirm, to quietly correct. No one guards themselves around you. And once I understood that, I understood the leverage embedded in invisibility. I didn't plan anything yet. I wasn't plotting. I was still grappling with what it meant to want more in a system that rewarded silence. I told myself I was just paying attention, learning, protecting myself. But roles have momentum, and once you see the one you've been assigned, you have a choice. Perform it forever, or decide when to step out of it. At the time, I didn't know which I would choose. I only knew that staying exactly where I was would cost me something I couldn't name yet, and that whatever came next would require me to act in ways that wouldn't look like action at all. The shift didn't happen in a meeting. It didn't happen during a confrontation or a moment of public dismissal. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, alone, with a spreadsheet open and my phone face down beside my keyboard. I was reviewing compensation projections for the following quarter. Work, I'd been asked to sanity check before it went to finance. This wasn't unusual. I often handled sensitive documents because I was discreet and accurate. As I scrolled, I noticed a line item labeled Leadership Incentive Adjustment. It was attached to Daniel's name. The number made me pause. It wasn't just the base increase. It was the bonus. A performance bonus tied to outcomes I had helped engineer, justified by metrics I had built, framed by efficiencies I had quietly ensured were sustainable. The amount wasn't abstract. It was life-altering. I did the math without meaning to. How long would it take me to earn that difference at my current trajectory? What would change if it were mine? The rent I wouldn't have to worry about. The debt could finally shrink instead of hovering. I felt something then, not anger, not jealousy, but clarity. Not about Daniel, about myself. I realized that I had been telling a story about who I was that no longer matched the reality of what I needed. I had told myself I was patient, that I was principled, that I was above office politics. But those beliefs had quietly become a way to avoid risk. The truth was simpler and less flattering. I was afraid of being seen and still denied. I minimized the spreadsheet and sat back in my chair. The office was unusually quiet. Late afternoon light filtered through the windows, softening everything. No one was watching. No one was waiting for my reaction. And in that privacy, I admitted something I hadn't allowed myself to say before. I wanted more. Not attention, not validation, agency, security, the ability to decide what my work was worth and to be compensated accordingly. Up until that moment, my silence had been reflexive, automatic. The default response of someone who had learned that staying agreeable kept the peace. But now, silence felt like a choice, and choices carry responsibility. I looked again at the numbers, at how easily my contributions had been translated into someone else's reward, how seamlessly the system absorbed my labor and redirected its value upward. This wasn't unfair in a dramatic way. It was unfair in a procedural way. And procedural unfairness is the hardest to challenge because it hides behind policy and precedent. I didn't think about revenge. I didn't fantasize about exposure or confrontation. What crossed my mind instead was a question, quiet and unsettling. What would it look like to stop protecting everyone else from the consequences of this system? Because that's what I'd been doing. Protecting Daniel by smoothing gaps. Protecting leadership by fixing problems before they surface. Protecting the narrative that everything was working as intended. If I stepped back, even slightly, things would change. I closed the spreadsheet without making comments. I told myself I'd return to it later. Instead, I opened my notebook, the one I kept in my bag, the one no one else ever saw. I wrote down the date, the document name, the numbers, not as evidence, as an acknowledgement. That was the day I stopped telling myself this was just how things were. I still didn't know what I would do, but I knew what I wouldn't do anymore. Quietly subsidize a future that didn't include me. Nothing outward changed that day. I still went to meetings. I still answered messages. I still supported the work. But internally, the story I was telling myself shifted from endurance to evaluation. And once that happens, it's only a matter of time before behavior follows belief. After that Tuesday, my silence stopped being passive. It didn't look any different from the outside. I was still composed, still responsive, still reliable. But internally, each decision to stay quiet became deliberate, measured, chosen. That distinction matters more than it sounds. Before I had been quiet because I didn't know how to speak without risk. Now I was quiet because I was observing what happened when I didn't intervene, when I didn't smooth, when I didn't correct things preemptively. The effects were subtle at first. A timeline slipped. A minor inconsistency went unaddressed until someone else noticed it. A meeting ended with unanswered questions that would have previously kept me up late, crafting follow-ups. No one blamed me. That was the point. The system had grown accustomed to my invisible labor, not to my authorship. Daniel began checking in more frequently. "Everything okay?" he'd ask. "You seem quieter than usual." I smiled and said I was fine, which was true, in a way. I felt calmer than I had in months. What surprised me was how quickly others filled the space I left behind, and how imperfectly they did it. The processes still worked, but they weren't seamless. Leadership noticed delays, not causes. They attributed it to growing pains, not structural dependence. I kept notes, not about mistakes, about assumptions, about how much of the organization's efficiency relied on work no one thought to attribute. How fragile that efficiency became when I stopped absorbing the friction. I also noticed how my silence was interpreted. No one asked me what I wanted. They assumed my quiet meant consent, that I was still content to play the role assigned to me. That assumption protected me from scrutiny and from intervention. Daniel, in particular, seemed to relax into that belief. He delegated more, shared less context, trusted that I would adapt. In his mind, I was still the constant. What he didn't see was that constancy can be weaponized, not through aggression, but through withdrawal. I wasn't sabotaging anything. I wasn't withholding information. I was simply no longer compensating for decisions made without me. The difference was small, but cumulative. There's a moral discomfort in that kind of restraint. It feels like complicity, like watching someone walk toward a gap you could point out and choosing not to. I wrestled with that discomfort privately, asked myself if this was ethical, if I were becoming someone I wouldn't recognize. But I kept returning to the same question. Why was the burden of fairness mine alone to carry? I hadn't created the system. I hadn't designed the incentives. I had just learned how to survive within them. One evening, Daniel messaged me late, asking if I could review something quickly. I looked at the document. It was a draft proposal for his promotion review, self-authored. He'd listed outcomes I knew were collaborative, framed challenges he'd navigated with my input as individual achievements. I read it carefully, then I closed it. I didn't correct it. I didn't challenge the framing. I didn't add context. I told myself this wasn't betrayal. It was accurate. He had authored the document. He had chosen the narrative. And narratives, once submitted, take on a life of their own. That night, I slept deeply. The next day, nothing exploded. No alarm sounded. The world continued, which in its own way was instructive. Silence, I was learning, is powerful not because it hides intent, but because it allows intent to unfold without interference. I still didn't know where this would lead. I hadn't crossed any obvious lines, but I could feel the ground shifting under the story others were telling about me. They thought I was stepping back. In reality, I was repositioning. What they never noticed wasn't a single action. It was a pattern of attention. While everyone else focused on outcomes and appearances, I paid attention to process, to dependencies, to the quiet places where assumptions lived unchallenged. This had always been my strength. I just hadn't understood its strategic value until now. I began documenting more deliberately, not just what I did, but how work moved through the organization. Who initiated requests, who approved the changes, where decisions stalled, where they accelerated. Over time, these observations formed a map, not of people, but of leverage. No one questioned this habit. Documentation was part of my job. In fact, it was encouraged. I was seen as thorough, not calculating. I noticed how often Daniel's confidence rested on infrastructure he didn't maintain, systems he trusted because they had never failed him, processes that worked because someone, me, was quietly correcting drift before it became visible. I also noticed something else. How much leadership relied on plausible narratives. They didn't verify everything. They trusted summaries. They rewarded clarity over completeness. That's not a flaw. It's a reality of scale. The person who controls the summary controls the story. And I had been writing the summaries, internally, informally, in my head, for years. I started paying closer attention to timelines around the promotion. What documentation was required? Who reviewed it? What kind of evidence carried weight? Performance metrics mattered, but so did consistency, risk mitigation, continuity. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very qualities that had made me invisible were now central to evaluating readiness for advancement. I didn't celebrate this realization. It wasn't triumphant. It was sobering, because it meant that if I chose to act, the consequences would be real. Not just for Daniel, but for the team, for myself. There would be no clean outcome. I also noticed how little anyone guarded against my perspective. Daniel spoke freely about his plans. Leadership assumed my alignment. I was invited into conversations because I was low drama, because I wouldn't take things personally. They were right, in a sense. I wasn't acting out of emotion. I was acting out of assessment. At home, my notebook is filled with observations, not accusations, not grievances, just facts, dates, dependencies, risk points. I told myself I was preparing contingencies, that I was being responsible. But preparation has a way of becoming intention if you don't interrupt it. One afternoon, I was asked to provide a risk assessment for a future initiative, something Daniel would oversee post-promotion. I wrote it carefully, objectively. I flagged areas that required hands-on oversight, continuity, deep system knowledge. I didn't attach my name to the expertise. I didn't say, "This is me." I let the document speak in neutral terms. Leadership responded with questions, reasonable ones. I answered them calmly, thoroughly. I made it clear that success depended on ongoing support structures being maintained without disruption. Still neutral, still professional. What they never noticed was how that language reframed readiness, not emotionally, but structurally. I wasn't positioning myself as a competitor. I was positioning the role as dependent on capabilities that weren't easily transferable. There's a difference. Daniel, meanwhile, was busy preparing for the next step, networking, presenting, aligning himself upward. He trusted that the foundation would hold, because it always had. I didn't correct that belief. At night, I asked myself if this was fair, if I were exploiting trust, if the quiet advantage I held made me responsible for protecting others from their own blind spots. But fairness, I was learning, is rarely enforced by the people who benefit from imbalance. I hadn't crossed the line yet. I hadn't revealed anything. I hadn't made any formal moves, but the groundwork was laid. What they never noticed was not my silence, but the way it sharpened my vision. And once you see clearly, it's hard to pretend you don't know exactly where to apply pressure, or when. The reveal didn't come from a dramatic discovery. It came from alignment. I was reviewing an internal audit summary, routine, dry, easy to skim. I'd been asked to confirm that certain operational safeguards were still in place. This kind of request landed on my desk
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ câu chuyện mới nhất. Hẹn gặp lại.